I'd make a few remarks about this essay by Immanuel Kant, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? We're reading this in two sessions. And the first reading is just the first five, I guess, sections. Really, we're going to concentrate mostly on the first four and then the very beginning of section five. But I just wanted to say this marks a kind of a new turn in the class after the midterm. We're still pursuing the same theme, which is, generally speaking, uh, the capacity of reason to find truth and the kind of obstacles that it finds. So far, we've been looking at, I would say, in a purely logical way, looking at the logical problems that reason finds in its pursuit of truth, and we will continue to do that. But there is a new element that's opened up here, and really starts with this essay by Kant, and then certainly continues with our reading of J.B. Bury's History of Freedom of Thought, and that is a social and historical element to the thing. This is an essay which is not so much about reason and logic in the manner of a Descartes or Hume, but it's an essay about the place of reason and logic in human society. The essay was written in 1784, which is the period known as the Enlightenment period, and certainly Kant was one of the central thinkers of the Enlightenment. He defined it, and he, in asking what is enlightenment, really asking, I think, what is the place of reason and inquiry in human life, in human history. The question, what is enlightenment, was one that was put to a lot of intellectuals at the time by a newspaper. So you had different people responding to the question, and that's the occasion for Kant's essay answering this question, what is enlightenment? And he has a very distinctive answer, and that is that enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. But most of us, even when we grow up, still think like children, which is a pretty interesting idea. But what does that mean? Well, I mean, we're familiar with what it means to to reason by authority, and that's pretty much what we do. He takes us to task for having other people lead us, doctors, priests, so on. And what we don't do is think for ourselves. So the self-imposed immaturity, he says, is the laziness and cowardice that we have, which causes us to depend upon others to do our thinking for us. And to be mature as opposed to be immature, be learning how to think for ourselves. And he recognizes that there are all sorts of social, psychological obstacles to begin thinking for yourself. And he has some very interesting ideas as to what the cure is, you might say. This is in paragraph 3, where he says, thus it is difficult for any individual man to work himself out of the immaturity that has all but become his nature. He has even become fond of this state. That is, individuals, we get into bad habits, and we are discouraged, and discourage ourselves, I guess, from thinking for ourselves. We become fond of the state, being taken care of in a way. So it's difficult for an individual person to, as he says, work himself out of the immaturity. Then he says something quite interesting in section 4, and that is that the public should enlighten itself is more likely. That is a very interesting idea, that it's easier for a community or a public to become enlightened than for an individual. And that's puzzling. It doesn't seem, why would he say that? Um, but he says, but that the public should enlighten itself is more likely. Indeed, if it is only allowed freedom, enlightenment is almost inevitable. For even among the entrenched guardians of the great masses, a few will always think for themselves, a few who, after having themselves thrown off the yoke of immaturity, will spread the spirit of a rational appreciation for both their own worth and for each person's calling to think for himself. But it should be particularly noted that if a public that was first placed in this yoke by the guardians is suitably aroused by some of those who are altogether incapable of enlightenment, it may force the guardians themselves to remain under the yoke. What's he talking about here? Well, um, what is it that allows a public to enlighten itself? Well, it's, as he says in the beginning of section 5, it's freedom of speech. Nothing is required for this enlightenment, however, except freedom, and the freedom in question is the least harmful of all, namely the freedom to use reason publicly in all matters. Now, what that means, the distinction between the public use of reason and the private use of reason, is something we'll talk about in class. But clearly, what he's advocating here is that the public use of reason, which is essentially reason speech addressed to the public, that it must remain free, and that if it is free, that what we call enlightenment will occur as a matter of course, that it will be inevitable that a public, a community, a nation, social group of any sort will become progressively more enlightened if there is a freedom to exchange ideas, to reason publicly in all matters.